Good day, everyone. This is Jennifer Butland, CCNE Executive Director, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to CCNE's second webinar in a series of 4 addressing the 2024 standards for accreditation of baccalaureate and graduate nursing programs. Just as a reminder, the standards are revised by the CCNE board. They will go into effect on January 1st of 2025. And we're thrilled to have you joining us to focus on Standard 2 and the key elements and supporting documentation related to Standard 2. This is being recorded, and we have 2 wonderful presenters for you who have a lot of experience with CCNE and the accreditation standards. If we could go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce our presenters. We have Dr. Shirlitha Dunlap and Dr. Angela Taylor with us. Dr. Dunlap is Dean and Professor of the Mary Black College of Nursing at University of South Carolina Upstate. And we also have Dr. Angela Taylor, who is the my screen just, something happened to my screen. My apologies. I can no longer see the presentation on my screen. But Dr. Taylor is president of Centera College of Health Sciences. And so I will work to sort that glitch out, but fortunately I almost have the standards memorized. And want to welcome everyone. I also want to share a couple of updates about CCNE that might be of interest to you before we get into the standards. We have a new initiative called Accreditation Connection. And all of our chief nurse administrators, other constituents, our on-site evaluators should have received an announcement about this a few weeks ago. But if you didn't, the information is in a call box on the CCNE website. And so if you go to the CCNE website, you will see information about Accreditation Connection. For any of you who has a postgraduate APRN certificate program that is not yet CCNE accredited, I strongly recommend that you attend tomorrow's session, which is open to all, at 2:00 p.m. Eastern time. That's November 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. It is dedicated to programs that do not yet have their postgraduate APRN certificate program accredited by CCNE. Now, if you hosted an on-site evaluation for accreditation of your certificate in the spring or fall of this year, you should be okay. But for those who have not yet scheduled one, or if you think that you may be establishing a new certificate program in the coming months or years, I strongly recommend that you join us tomorrow. You can sign up at 2:00 tomorrow Eastern to join that Accreditation Connection session. The Accreditation Connections are ways for CCNE and our constituents to dialogue periodically over the course of the year on various topics of interest. So we're really excited to launch this. You should look at sessions that interest you and join those sessions. We will give a brief presentation lasting about 10 minutes in those sessions, followed by some discussion on the topic and then some networking opportunities for the attendees. So I just wanted to make an announcement about that. So with that said, why don't we get started on Standard 2? Dr. Dunlap, you're going to first review some of the substantive changes that have occurred regarding Standard 2, and then we're going to get into the key elements themselves. So take it away.
All right, thank you, Dr. Budland. So I'm going to start and get us kicked off with Standard 2. Standard 2 is all about institutional commitment and resources. So when you're looking at Standard 2, as you start to navigate it, you can ask yourself 2 main questions. The first one is, how does the parent institution demonstrate the ongoing commitment to and support for the nursing program? And the second question you can ask is, how are faculty and staff as resources of the program supported to enable them to achieve the mission goals and expected program outcomes? Now, resources are typically considered in four main categories that can be either physical resources, fiscal resources, human resources, or academic support / technological resources. So it's important to address your institution's commitment in the form of these resources as you navigate through Standard 2 and these resources that are needed for program quality. Now, CCNE does not define the resources required. So CCNE is not going to say you need this size budget, this number of faculty, this amount for salaries, or this faculty to student ratio. These are all defined by you, the program or the institution. So also when I talk about human resources, yes, that does include your faculty. And also, are they adequately prepared for the areas they teach? Does the faculty to student ratio meet the needs of the program in achieving the mission goals and expected outcomes? And this may look different by program level. It may look different for the BSN versus the MSN versus the DMP and or by track. And it also includes your part-time as well as full-time faculty. So also keep in mind that your program's resources can come from other areas. For example, they can be provided directly via the program or indirectly via other departments. Library, for instance, is a good example. And since some of this information that you consider applicable for Standard 2 may not be information you want publicly available, you want to be mindful of that if you are writing a self-study, because the self-study is considered a public document. So first, I'm going to go into some of the substantive changes for Standard 2. And I'm not going to go in depth into these substantive changes because we'll talk about each one of these more specifically as we go into each individual key element. But for right now, I'll just give a brief overview. So the first bullet talks about the creation of two distinct key elements related to physical resources and clinical sites. This was previously key element 2B, which was combined. Physical resources and clinical sites were together. Now in the 2024 standards, we see key element 2B and 2C as two separate key elements, one for physical resources and one for clinical sites. The second bullet addresses clarification about the process for regular review and improvements of academic support services, whether those services are provided directly by the program, institution, or an online program manager, or other third-party vendor. And this is in key element 2D. And this is new language because we see more and more programs partnering with external agencies in order to meet their educational goals. And it's important to understand that the program still maintains the earnest responsibility of ensuring the adequacy of support services when engaged with such vendors. And we'll talk more about that as well. And the last bullet is clarification of and added flexibility regarding requirements for academic and experiential preparation of faculty teaching in the nursing program. And this is now key element 2F, formerly key element 2E. And my colleague, Dr. Taylor, will go over it in greater detail when she talks about some of the changes to the previous 2E, which is now currently 2F, with added flexibility and criteria for the preparation of faculty. On the next slide is 3 additional substantive changes for Standard 2. And the first bullet talks about added language regarding a recommended 1:8 faculty to student ratio for indirect faculty supervision in nurse practitioner track. This is key element 2F. Keep in mind, the key word that you see here is recommended, because as I mentioned earlier, CCNE does not prescribe the number of faculty you need or your ratios. However, this is a recommendation for faculty who supervise nurse practitioner tracks, and we'll talk more about that as well. The second bullet is added language regarding appropriate exceptions related to certification and qualifications of faculty who oversee APRN tracks. And the third bullet is added language to supporting documentation requiring evidence that faculty who oversee an APRN track hold national certification or advanced practice clinical expertise in the same population focus area of practice as the track. And this language is not new language. It was actually was required in the previous standards, but it was language that was added to the 2024 standards so that this document can serve as a standalone document.
Before we move on to the key elements by key element, as well as the elaborations, I'd like to encourage our audience, and I'm thrilled that we have about 350 participants live, I want to encourage you to type in your questions that you might have about the key elements under Standard 2 into the chat. We have staff monitoring the chat, and the presenters are also looking at your questions so that we can incorporate responses as we go along and address them verbally as appropriate. But the goal is for everyone to get the answers to their questions. We have a pretty diverse audience today. We have a number of chief nurse administrators as well as faculty. Presumably, you're preparing a self-study for 2025 or 2026 or beyond, or you're preparing for a continuous improvement progress report or other report that is due to CCNE after January 1st of 2025. So we welcome all of our program constituents, and we also have many on-site evaluators here and some others from state boards of nursing and national nursing organizations. So all are welcome. And I want to just say another word about our presenters. Both Doctors Dunlap and Taylor served on the standards committee that resulted in our 2024 standard revisions and the document ultimately being approved by the CCNE Board of Commissioners. So they have really in-depth knowledge of the content and the rationale and the expectations set forth by CCNE relative to the standards. Also, they both have experience hosting a CCNE on-site evaluation, as well as leading evaluation teams for the conduct of an accreditation review. Dr. Taylor congratulations, Dr. Taylor, you've been elected by our constituents to join the CCNE Board of Commissioners on January 1st, representing chief nurse administrators. So I did want to point that out, as well as your service on the Substantive Change Review Committee. And Dr. Dunlap has also served and will be leading the Report Review Committee for CCNE, and also has a great experience with the standards and the accreditation review process. So thank you to both of you for those special roles that you play. And I just thought it was important for our audience to have that context so they know what great value they have in getting their questions asked today. So thank you. And we look forward to answering your questions. Okay, let's go on with the key elements then.
Okay, thanks, Jen, and you're welcome. Feel free, guys, to ask questions from any direction. We'd be glad to answer them because that's what this opportunity is for. And so I'll jump right into key element 2A and get us started. Key element 2A is fiscal resources are sufficient to enable the program to fulfill its mission, goals, and expected outcomes. And adequacy of fiscal resources is reviewed periodically, and resources are modified as needed. So it is important for the program to provide a narrative on how the budget provides support in the development, implementation, and evaluation of the program under review. In this key element, think about how the program goes about periodically reviewing the budget. What does that process look like? And have there been any significant changes in fiscal resources allocated to the program? And if so, how has the program adapted to those changes? Now, CCNE does not require information on salaries of faculty members in the self-study, appendices, or the resource room. Rather, it is helpful for the program to instead provide an analysis of the compensation and how it supports the recruitment and retention of faculty and staff for the programs under review. And you can use national data to help benchmark those salaries as an aggregate rather than individual salaries. Also, if you provide an overall budget for the nursing unit, it is also important to address the fiscal resources that are program specific. For example, if your DNP program is under review, if there are specific resources, financial resources that are allocated for the DNP program, highlighting those. And the same thing if it's your baccalaureate or your master's program or the postgraduate certificate. This will assist the team when the evaluation site visit is there to promptly ascertain the adequacy of the resources for the program under review. And also it helps the board when they are reviewing your self-study documents. At the end of Standard 2, you will find a description of specific supporting documentation. This includes providing the nursing unit budget for the current and previous fiscal years, 2 fiscal years in the supporting documentation. It might be helpful to consider providing this information using tables that are accompanied by a brief narrative, and that can help to give it more clarity and more depth. And so now I'm gonna go to key element 2B. Key element 2B looks at physical resources and that they enable the program to fulfill its mission, goals, and expected outcomes. And the adequacy of physical resources is reviewed periodically and resources are modified as needed. So this key element requires that the program address physical resources used by the program under review. And the same thing as we mentioned earlier, looking at the BSN, MSN, and DNP and postgrad certificate, if those resources are different per program. And describe the process used to ensure that the physical resources are adequate for students enrolled in the program, so that a defined process to determine the currency, availability, accessibility of resources, and modifications is expected to be present. Examples of physical resources during the evaluation might include your clinical simulation center. You may look at your laboratory, classroom space, workspace, office space, meeting rooms, supplies that you have available for your students as well. Further, it is expected that the program reviews the physical resources periodically as stipulated by you, the program. You determine what that periodic time frame looks like for your specific degree program. Next, we'll go to key element 2C. And as I mentioned earlier, 2C is now a new key element that is by itself. It was previously combined. So a lot of the language that you see for 2C will look like 2B because with clinical sites is pulled out to form its own key element. So 2C states that clinical sites enable the program to fulfill its mission, goals, and expected outcomes. Adequacy of clinical sites is reviewed periodically and resources are modified as needed. So this is one of the changes we discussed, as I just mentioned, and the requirements of this key element remain essentially the same, but the language has been streamlined and is simplified a little bit here. The program must ensure that clinical sites are sufficient and appropriate. In the elaboration, it states that the program provides students with information regarding the responsibilities of the program and, if any, the expectations of the student in identifying clinical sites. This is important because the students should have some knowledge of what is expected of them when they are enrolled in the program. And I would even say too, before they're enrolled in the program, as a prospective student, knowing what the expectations will be for them in identifying a clinical site. CCNE does not prohibit students from securing clinical placements or having a role in securing clinical placements, but when students are involved in the process, it is expected that the program work with students to ensure that an appropriate clinical placement is secured. And ultimately, it is the program's responsibility for providing adequate clinical sites, which is clearly stated in the first sentence of the elaboration, which says, the program is responsible for providing adequate clinical sites. For example, now a student may be experiencing difficulty in obtaining an appropriate clinical site. And if that happens, it is an expectation that the program assume responsibility for ensuring that the clinical site is acquired. This may mean the student may need to travel. It may even result in an out-of-state experience for the student. For example, a lot of times you may have an online program. For example, I'm in South Carolina, may have a student who's in Tennessee, and they may not be able to find a site in Tennessee, but I can find a site for them here in South Carolina. So we understand that there may be some creativity that needs to exist to help students get the experience, but it's simply not enough to provide students with a list of agencies with no assistance. So I'll reiterate, because this is important, it is acceptable for a program to allow students to identify a clinical site. But if the student is not successful or requires assistance, it is the program's ultimate responsibility to ensure an adequate clinical site is identified that is appropriate to achieve the mission, goals, and expected outcomes. Okay. Now I'm going to go to key element 2D, academic support services. Academic support services are sufficient to meet program and student needs and are evaluated on a regular basis. evaluate on a regular basis, excuse me. So this was one of the substantive changes that we talked about, and there was clarification about the process for regular review and improvement of academic support services, whether services are provided directly by the program, institution, or online program manager or other third-party vendor. This key element focuses on academic support services provided by the program. Keep in mind that they should be reviewed once again on a regular basis, and improvements are discussed and implemented as appropriate. Typically, academic support services may include library, technology, admission, and advising services, distance support, as well as research support. And think also for programs that may offer online programs, consider electronic access to resources. For example, if there's, for the library, is there a virtual chat available to assist faculty or students when they may need to do some distance learning there? Or maybe if a student is doing a project, maybe you use a learning management system that allows the student to do their present their project online in lieu of a face-to-face presentation. So these are some of the things that we would consider when you're looking at that you should consider when you're looking at your academic support services. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Angela Taylor, who will take us into key element 2E.
Thank you, Dr. Dunlap. So key element 2E is a focus, and again, it's a new key element, not a new key element, but it's renumbered as key element 2E. It used to be key element 2D. And this one still focuses on the chief nurse administrator of the nursing unit. And the chief nurse administrator must be a registered nurse, hold a graduate degree in nursing. And if the nursing unit offers a graduate program in nursing, the chief nurse administrator must hold a doctoral degree. And the program must show that the chief nurse administrator is vested with the administrative authority to accomplish the mission, goals, and expected program outcomes, and provides effective leadership to the nursing unit in achieving its mission, goals, and expected program outcomes. And this key element actually had no substantive changes in it for the current standards. Could we move to key, well, just a few things to keep in mind. If you go to the next slide, please. Keep in mind that if the nursing unit offers a graduate level nursing program, again, the chief nurse administrator must have a doctoral degree, regardless of the graduate program's accreditation status. And it applies even if only the baccalaureate program is under review by CCNE. So if they have a graduate program, the chief nurse administrator must have a doctoral degree. All chief nurse administrators must have a graduate degree in nursing, and this could be at a master's or a doctoral level. If the chief nurse administrator has a master's degree in nursing, the doctoral degree does not need to be in nursing. Next slide, please, as we look at key element 2F. And this key element does have some substantive changes in it. Faculty are sufficient in number to accomplish the mission, goals, and expected program outcomes. They are academically prepared for the areas in which they teach, and they are experientially prepared for the areas in which they teach. And you'll see the substantive changes primarily in the elaboration. So the changes for the 2024 standards include clarification of requirements for academic and experiential preparation of faculty teaching didactic in baccalaureate and graduate nursing programs. Clarification of requirements for academic and experiential preparation of faculty teaching clinical in baccalaureate and graduate nursing programs, as well as 4 requirements if faculty teaching clinical in the baccalaureate program do not have a graduate degree. There's also added language regarding a recommended 1:8 faculty to student ratio for indirect faculty supervision in nurse practitioner tracks. And there is added language regarding appropriate exceptions related to certification and qualifications of faculty who oversee APR and tracks. So let's take a closer look at these changes on the next few slides. And as I mentioned already, the changes are embedded in the revised elaboration statements. So if you look partway down, let's see. If you go to the next slide, Daniel, I think. Oh, I think we got ahead. We're ahead one slide. So back one slide. Okay, so if you look partway through this first paragraph, there is a statement that says for nurse practitioner tracks, the recommended faculty to student ratio for indirect faculty supervision, which may include clinical coordination, engagement with preceptors and clinical partners, and monitoring and evaluating student progress is 1:8. And that is a new statement in the elaboration. The next paragraph is also new. Faculty are academically prepared for the areas in which they teach. Academic preparation of faculty includes degree specialization, specialty coursework, or other preparation sufficient to address the major concepts included in courses that they teach. Faculty teaching didactic in the baccalaureate, master's, DMP, and/or postgraduate APR and certificate programs have a graduate degree. So there are no exceptions for faculty who are teaching didactic. They must have a graduate degree. Next slide, please. This is a continuation then of the elaboration. Faculty teaching clinical in the master's DMP and/or postgraduate APR and certificate programs have a graduate degree. Faculty teaching clinical in the baccalaureate program hold a graduate degree. However, any faculty teaching clinical in the baccalaureate degree program who do not hold a graduate degree must meet these 4 criteria. They must hold a baccalaureate degree in nursing, have significant clinical experience, be enrolled in a graduate program or otherwise qualified. And here's some examples of how they can be otherwise qualified. They could have completed relevant graduate level courses or continuing education units. They may hold relevant national certification for the clinical areas in which they teach. And then the last bullet point that is required is that they have purposeful engagement with informal oversight by a graduate prepared faculty member. And again, I just want to reiterate that all of these 4 bullet points are required. You'll see that the conjunction between the 3rd and 4th bullet point is and. So if they do not hold a graduate degree and they are teaching clinical in the baccalaureate program, they must meet all 4 of these criteria. Right. And the next slide. Faculty teaching clinical are experienced in and maintain clinical expertise in the relevant clinical area. Clinical expertise may be maintained through clinical practice or other means. Faculty teaching in advanced practice clinical courses meet certification and practice requirements as specified by the relevant regulatory and specialty bodies. Faculty who are nurses hold a current RN or APRN license. Faculty who oversee an APRN track are nationally certified in the same population-focused area of practice in roles for which national certification is available. And the last part of this paragraph provides a partial list of exceptions. And I'm not going to read these to you. Feel free to read them to yourselves, but remember that this may not be an all-inclusive list. These are examples of exceptions that your program may be experiencing and that you can provide in your self-study. Next slide, please. Few things to keep in mind. CCNE does not prescribe faculty to student ratio, does not prescribe the number of full-time versus part-time or adjunct faculty, and it does not prescribe minimum FTEs. The program is responsible for demonstrating that faculty are sufficient in number and academically and experientially prepared for the areas in which they teach.
Great. Well, I'd like to pause on 2F, if that's okay. And let's go back to the beginning of 2F, Daniel. We have a few questions about 2F. And for those who are more intimately familiar with the 2018 standards for accreditation, the key element was 2E, like Edward, and now it's 2F, like Francesca. So focusing on 2F, someone in the chat has asked the question, does the graduate degree need to be in nursing? And the answer is no. When CCNE says, graduate degree is required, but we didn't name a specific field, that was intentional to give some flexibility. For example, somebody in the chat has noted that there might be a PharmD, a pharmacist, teaching a course. There could be an MSW, Master's in Social Work, teaching a course. And that is certainly appropriate so long as the course content is relevant and that graduate prepared person in a different field is appropriate to be teaching that content for your nursing students. Any thoughts from our presenters about that question or anything that you'd like to elaborate on?
No, I think you hit it. You got it accurate.
Let's go to the next slide. There's also a question about, just want to emphasize here, because there are some changes, some significant changes. I would actually argue that they're not so much changes as they are clarifications from what was in the 2018 accreditation standards. Our constituents really called on us during the call for comment periods and the forums that we offered in the standards revision process to add some clarity about, what would be accepted versus what is not acceptable when it comes to graduate faculty preparation. And there was broad consensus. I'm not going to say unanimous because that's a very high bar, but I would say there was a very broad consensus that any faculty teaching in a baccalaureate or graduate level program who's teaching didactic must have a graduate degree. And so we did preserve that expectation. We also added some enhancements, if you will, to the expectations related to faculty who are teaching clinical in a baccalaureate level program. And if we could go to the next slide, there are those 4 areas that Dr. Dunlap was discussing. So I really want to emphasize here that these 4 bullets, as Dr. Angela Taylor clearly mentioned, all 4 of those are required in the event that you do have a faculty member who is teaching clinical in a baccalaureate program who does not have a graduate degree. Now, some of you might be asking, well, do we have to also provide this evidence if all of our faculty teaching clinical in a baccalaureate do have a graduate degree? And the answer is no. We don't need you to address those 4 bullets because you're already demonstrating that your faculty teaching clinical in a baccalaureate program have a graduate degree. So this expectation is only in the event that you have faculty teaching in that area without a graduate degree. The other thing I want to emphasize is that there is no exemption for faculty teaching didactic. They have to have a graduate degree, or there will be a compliance concern in the accreditation process. And also, if the faculty are teaching clinical in a graduate level program, i.e. the master's, the DNP, or the certificate, they also have to have a graduate degree, and there is no waiver or exemption, even if your state board allows for such a waiver. So CCNE has established these national accreditation standards that need to be met by our programs, regardless of what state you're located in, the locale, regardless of what the state board requires. And so this is for national consistency, and it affords a great amount of flexibility to programs, because what we would see earlier is programs didn't really know what to provide as evidence. And now we've really laid out the expectations clearly for what needs to be provided. Let me ask our presenters, might this be done in the form of a table? Let's say there are 3 or 4 faculty teaching clinical in a baccalaureate program who don't hold a graduate degree. What are some examples of ways that programs might provide that evidence as part of their self-study document?
Dr. Butlin, I've seen it done a couple of ways when we're looking at faculty qualifications. I think probably the most common way is in a table. It's sometimes that's easier to consume, particularly if there are larger numbers of faculty members teaching in a program. But I've also seen it in narrative form if it's a smaller faculty, or you have just a handful that you are looking at really describing how we're overseeing, for example, within these 4 areas. Some people may be more comfortable providing that in a narrative form. So I've seen it a variety of ways.
Yeah. Dr. Dunlap, any additional thoughts there?
No, I'm not in agreement. I think Angela
great.
covered it all very well.
Good. Well, okay, so there are some other questions in the chat. I think they're very good because they've picked up on some flexibilities that are built into the process. Somebody has asked, what is considered an appropriate number of graduate level courses or continuing education units? How will CCNE be assessing that? And as I look through these 4 bullets, one of the things that someone might be asking is, well, what does CCNE consider significant clinical experience? Is it a certain number of hours? Is there a certain number of CEUs that a person needs to hold? And the answer is, these have been intentionally written so that the onus is on the program to present the evidence clearly, to show that these faculty are in fact qualified by virtue of their academic and their experiential preparation to be teaching whatever their teaching assignments are and their role in your nursing program, that they're qualified. And in some cases, maybe there are 5 CEU credits that would be appropriate to show, mastery or knowledge in a certain area. In other cases, that might not be appropriate. And so the Board of Commissioners was purposeful in terms of not saying you have to have 10 years of clinical experience or 5 years of clinical experience. Certainly, based on what you're teaching, there could be some variability in what would be considered to be appropriate in that area. I think the same is true with the use of the word purposeful engagement with and formal oversight by graduate prepared faculty. Some of the things that we've seen in self-studies and in conducting evaluations is sort of an afterthought, or it's not very structured in terms of the engagement that faculty without a graduate degree have and the formal oversight that they are given by graduate prepared faculty. So it should be planned, it should be purposeful, intentional, and not sort of an afterthought, or sometimes happening with some faculty and not happening with other faculty. I want to pause there to just invite our presenters to comment on some of the words that are used here, the intent to provide flexibility, but also maybe give us some examples of what you as a decision maker of the board or committee member or evaluator would be looking for.
Yeah, I think, when you have faculty, they all come to us from many diverse backgrounds, and they have lots of various experiences as well. And that's why this is written the way it is. And that gives the flexibility of the program to be able to look at that individual and assess them as a unique person to say, can this person help us achieve the mission and goals and outcomes of the program? If you may have a nurse with a baccalaureate degree who has over 15 or 20 years in OB expertise, but you may have another individual who has 2 years, but they have lots of certifications, 18 credit hours toward their graduate degree, and they're doing a whole lot of other stuff that they may have. And the person who has 20 years may just have enrolled in the program. And so we just want to make sure that the flexibility is there for the diverse faculty who could be teaching in your program.
I think one of the keys here, again, I want to emphasize that all 4 bullets must be satisfied, addressed and satisfied. So, and the reason I want to emphasize that again is that somebody has asked the question, how many continuing education units would be considered adequate for the BSN that's not enrolled in a master's program? Well, you know, I want to emphasize that bullet 3, you have some flexibility. If your faculty member who's BSN prepared is enrolled in a graduate program, then you don't have to address how they're otherwise qualified. And the parenthetical statement where it says e.g., that means, for example, this does not represent all of the possible ways that a program could demonstrate that someone who is not enrolled in a graduate program is otherwise qualified. So we would rely on you to the faculty in the program to make your best case, put it forward. And again, the onus is on the program to show that they are qualified for the clinical areas in which they teach. Dr. Dunlap, did you have additional comments there?
No, I do not. Dr. Taylor, did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the last bullet point, the purposeful engagement with and formal oversight by a graduate prepared faculty member. I think there are so many ways that this can be accomplished. And a couple of the thoughts that come to mind that I have either seen or been a part of was perhaps you might have a formal mentorship program where you are assigned a formal mentor, and there is a formal program of that mentorship where there are maybe monthly structured activities or weekly structured activities. Perhaps you have assigned that person a graduate prepared faculty member, and they have weekly meetings where they talk about what they're teaching and how their clinical is going, and that a person that they're assigned to is helping them process what's going on with their clinical, helping them think about a variety of different ways to manage student activities and student occurrences. Or perhaps the graduate prepared faculty member is working side by side with the baccalaureate prepared faculty member, helping them grade the student assignments and working through some of their clinical evaluations and clinical care plans or whatever the assignments might be. So I think, again, it's up to the program to look at how they're going to meet that 4th bullet point, but I think the opportunities are practically endless as to how you might meet that.
Yeah, that's good. Any other, I have a few other things that I want to focus on relative to 2F based on the chat. But any other comments from either of you about purposeful engagement and formal oversight by faculty? I know that there's a variety of ways programs have successfully done this. I think when most of the citations that we've seen at CCNE around this topic have been when programs fail to address it in their self-study document, and they don't define what they mean by formal oversight. And so it's really there's a lack of substance and understanding about what the roles are, how that occurs, how regularly it happens, the purpose, that kind of thing. Somebody has asked, well, anything else on that last bullet?
No.
So there are some questions about what do we mean by faculty when we're talking about these requirements in key element 2F? Somebody has asked, does 2F and these requirements here only apply to full-time faculty? Dr. Taylor, do you want to respond to that?
And no, they actually apply to all faculty, whether you are thinking about your full-time faculty, part-time, or adjunct faculty. This key element applies to all of them.
Yeah. We have some institutions that don't have many full-time faculty, if any full-time faculty anymore. There are certainly trends in hiring more part-time and adjunct faculty to support academic programs, not just in nursing, but across a variety of professions. And so we acknowledge that there are many faculty models out there. You know, some have tenure track, some don't. Some rely heavily on adjunct or part-time faculty, others don't. But regardless of their percentage time dedicated to your program, regardless of their title, these are the expectations. There's a question, can a master's prepared adjunct faculty member teach a lab course in a DNP program? I assume the answer is yes, because CCNE does not preclude a master's prepared adjunct faculty member from teaching a lab course in a DNP program. Any thoughts on that question?
You're correct. No, there's no prohibition against it. And I think this comes up too sometimes with, and it's not in this key element, but with preceptors as well. There's no, it doesn't say that you can't have someone with a master's degree for a DNP program.
Yeah. There's another question. And the question is, the person is asking, well, I'll just read it verbatim. So to be clear, clinical faculty with a BSN degree must hold a relevant national certification? And the answer is no, that is not accurate.
Right.
Right. That's that third bullet with that flexibility.
Yeah,
yes.
This slide 14 does not say that clinical faculty with a BSN degree must hold relevant national certification. So we hope it's clear that third bullet where it says hold relevant national certification is one of several examples of how you can show that a faculty member that is not enrolled in a graduate program is otherwise qualified. So again, go back to the bullets, read them carefully, and I think that's our best advice, so that you don't miss anything. Because if a program is providing evidence of compliance for 2F and they forget to address any of these bullets, and they have faculty who do not have a graduate degree teaching clinical in the baccalaureate, it is going to be a compliance concern. So you do have to collect some data, therefore, from your faculty, any faculty that you might have who are teaching clinical in a baccalaureate program who do not have a graduate degree. I think we've already had a discussion already about how, significant clinical experience is defined. It really depends. And keep in mind, this all relates to what it is they're teaching for your program. So as long as they have significant clinical experience related to what they're teaching, that's what we're looking for. For APRN, here's another question. For APRN track courses, do individual didactic courses need to be taught by graduate level with current APRN certification or qualified experience of course topics sufficient? So first of all, I would break that down to say, well, if they're teaching a didactic course, yes, they have to have a graduate degree. That's clear in our expectations. So in terms of whether every single didactic course that an APRN student might be taking has to be taught by somebody with current APRN certification, I think I would say the answer is no. because we don't say that every faculty member who might be teaching an APRN track course is required to have national certification. The course may or may not be a course that would require that. And so let me ask if our presenters have any further thoughts on that. We do have language, a
Yes.
couple of slides down that addresses that. So do you want to sort of discuss some of those expectations in the last paragraph of the elaboration to 2F?
Yeah, on Dr. Taylor's slide, I think it's slide number 15. Did you get to that slide yet, Dr. Taylor, or were you headed there?
Yes, it was covered, yes.
Okay, so that's where you see some of the exceptions
Yes.
that this individual may be referencing. So it's not a requirement that they have one in the exact track, as Dr. Butler has mentioned. There are some exceptions here that are listed on slide number 15. Yes.
Yeah. So I think the answer really to this person's question is it depends on what the course is. Right. It depends on what the course is.
Yeah.
You know,
and also,
whether
and also it says exceptions may include, which means there could be other exceptions if they can be justified, and if it and it meets the objectives of that course and that individual is qualified, then those exceptions could be considered.
Okay. There's another question related to this key element about supervision. So somebody who is supervising a clinical course or simulation courses, is that considered didactic or clinical? Let me repeat that. Does supervision of clinical courses or simulation courses count as didactic or clinical?
So your didactic is your lecture courses. Dr. Taylor, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say simulation typically counts as clinical hours.
So that would really be considered somebody teaching clinical as opposed to didactic.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So let's see. Regardless, oh, that's Priya's answer to a question. Okay. I'm trying to get through all of these here. Somebody is commenting that they have full-time faculty with graduate degrees doing site visits, conducting orientation with the adjunct faculty, engaging them with student problem solving. So there are some people sharing what they do, you know, in their programs. So those who are monitoring the chat might want to take a look at this. I think we've gotten through a lot. Do these bullets apply to affiliate instructors, practicing clinical nurses who act as a clinical instructor extender in the clinical site, but do not do assessment or evaluation of students?
And that is yes, because they would still be considered faculty.
Yep. So I think the takeaway here is, you know, as a national nursing accreditor, we want to provide flexibility in the types of faculty appointments and the titling of faculty. So whether you call them an instructor, an assistant professor, you know, a tenured professor, part-time adjunct, they're serving in the capacity of a faculty member. And so, you know, if CCNE didn't apply the standards that way and we prescribe certain titles, it would become problematic for a whole host of other reasons. And then people would call them names to get out of complying with accreditation requirements, right? There would be all these titles that would be developed for faculty to get out of having to show evidence of compliance with national standards. So regardless of what the titling is and the rank and the percentage of time of these faculty, you do need to address these expectations under key element 2F. So, okay. So a great question here that is about faculty who might be teaching in an entry-level master's. Is the expectation that they have a graduate degree?
And the answer to that is yes. They must have a master's degree, a graduate degree, because they are teaching in a graduate program.
Yes. So you'll notice in our accreditation standards, there's no carve out that says that there's an exception for faculty teaching in an entry-level graduate program. That was specifically discussed by the committee and the board, and it was felt that it is a graduate level program. The faculty should have graduate level degree, even if the content is entry level for an entry level master's program, for example. Okay, so that is something to pay attention to for those of you with entry graduate programs. Okay, and somebody else has commented that some state boards may require a doctorate, not allowing an MSN prepared faculty in the lab, for example. And that is very true. All of you should be aware of your state board requirements and should separately make sure that you're complying with those. In some cases, there might be a slight difference between a CCNE requirement and a state regulatory requirement, but you would have to demonstrate for the state's purpose that you're complying with their expectation, complying with CCNE's expectations when pursuing CCNE accreditation. Okay, great. So,
And Jen, I was going to say, someone mentioned the state, but sometimes there are also maybe differences with the institutional accreditor as well. And so making sure that they're ensuring that compliance with those other bodies.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, great. So good. Well, we've really gone through that. I think we've answered a lot of questions that was on people's minds. I'll continue to monitor the chat, but let's go ahead and proceed with the last two key elements, and then we're going to address some more questions because we've got some really great questions from our audience.
Right, thank you, Dr. Butlin. Key element 2G, and again, that's renumbered. Preceptors, whether you call them mentors or guides or coaches, if they are used by the program as an extension of faculty, are academically and experientially qualified for their role. And there really were no changes in this key element, but just to reiterate that you have to make sure that the roles and performance expectations are clearly defined and communicated, that they are congruent with the mission goals and expected student outcomes, and congruent with relevant professional nursing standards and guidelines, and reviewed periodically and revised as appropriate. Again, the last line here says the program is responsible for evaluating the performance of preceptors. And someone asked earlier, what are some of the things that you sometimes see overlooked in self-studies or on visits? And I would say in my experience as an evaluator, that sometimes this is the piece with regard to preceptors that may be overlooked. And that is the responsibility of the program for continually evaluating the performance of preceptors. So it's not just looking at whether or not they are academically and experientially qualified to become preceptors, but then looking at their performance as a preceptor. Next slide, please. Key element 2H. The parent institution and program provide and support an environment that encourages faculty teaching, scholarship, service, and practice in keeping with the mission, goals, and expected faculty outcomes. And again, it's up to the program to identify from their institutional perspective, what are the key areas that are required for the faculty. Obviously, they're all going to be involved in teaching, but there are different requirements for scholarship, service, and practice. And the goal here is for the program to talk about those and ensure that the parent institution and the program are providing that support. Again, standard 2 is all about institutional resources. And so if you think about those questions that Dr. Dunlap presented when she introduced standard 2, that's where this comes into play with regard to what are the expectations of faculty and how are the program and the parent institution supporting those. Next slide.
Great. Before we get into the supporting documentation that is required for standard 2, I want to address a few more questions. I see a question about what is the rationale for CCNE referring to and requiring a calendar year of data? And that is true not just of standard 2, but throughout the standards, and particularly in standard 4. The rationale is that a calendar year is a baseline that everybody can get on the same page about. From a national perspective, calendar year means January 1st through December 31st. And that is a measure that can be applied consistently by a national specialized accreditor across programs, whether it's a private institution, a public institution, urban, rural, regardless of region or state. And so for consistency purposes and to be looking at data in a meaningful way across programs and at the national level, calendar year is a common data point. If we were to use fiscal year or academic year, there would be a huge amount of variability, even within a region, within a state, in similar types of institutions. And so calendar year was used for consistency. We recognize that you get data from state boards and certifiers and others, perhaps differently than aligns with your calendar year or fiscal year or academic year. But CCNE does require that the data requested in our standards are presented by calendar year as indicated. There are exceptions. For example, number 1, in supporting documentation, we're looking at a fiscal year. So we're looking at a current and previous 2 fiscal years. But for most other areas where we're requiring data, it's by calendar year to establish consistency across programs at a national level. So thank you for asking that question. There's also a question about, what are some common pitfalls or areas that our presenters have observed that are commonly omitted from a self-study or from a continuous improvement progress report or any other report that might then result in a compliance concern or a follow-up report. As we reflect on standard 2 specifically, what are your thoughts in terms of don't forget to include X? What would be your thoughts for our audience?
Well, I think just a reminder that these new standards don't go into effect until January. So we don't know what the compliance concerns will look like with this set of standards. But just thinking backwards, previously, I think the faculty qualifications was one that was always an issue when it comes to providing the documentation to support it. and making sure that that it's acknowledged what those faculty are teaching and their experience and their qualifications. So that one, it was previously 2E, was now 2F. And so hopefully, and I'm very hopeful with the revisions and the increased flexibility, that it will be much better moving forward.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah,
another area that I have seen is also in clinical sites, the availability of clinical sites, making sure that the clinical sites are appropriate to meet the needs of the students and help the program meet its outcomes. And to ensure that our students are progressing through their programs in a timely fashion and that the program is really supporting the students in finding their clinical sites and clinical opportunities.
sometimes we get the question related to this first of the supporting documentation areas. You know, what if my program is new and we only have our current fiscal year plus 1 year of budget? What do we do? And the answer is you provide what you have, because you know, you can't make up you know, a fiscal year budget that prior to your program being operational, right? So when CCNE requires the nursing unit budget for the current and previous 2 fiscal years, if you only have the current and 1 fiscal year because you're new, then that's okay. You present what you have. But if you do have the current plus 2 prior fiscal year budgets, then you are required to provide all. So a word about the supporting documentation. You know, as is the case for each of the 4 standards, the supporting documentation that's listed in our publication needs to be included in the self-study document or the evaluation resource materials, which is really the virtual resource room that used to be the on-site resource room that is now required to be made available electronically to evaluation teams at least 7 days prior to the on-site evaluation. We do recognize that reasonable alternatives exist to what is provided here when providing documentation to address the key elements. Some of the supporting documentation might not apply. For example, you might not have a collective bargaining agreement. So obviously we're not going to require you to provide that if it doesn't exist. So let's take it all the way through the 16 areas. And I just want to invite our presenters to highlight or offer some tips for our audience. Looking at the first 5 areas of supporting documentation, is there anything notable or that you'd like to highlight? I already discussed the fiscal budget. How about in number 2 regarding OPMs or third-party vendors? What are your thoughts on that?
If you have the contracts available and you can share those, that would be helpful to put possibly in your virtual resource room. As I mentioned earlier, just remember when you're thinking about what you want to put in the self-study document versus what you want to put in the resource room. If it goes in the self-study, it is a public document. And sometimes those contracts are proprietary information and you may not want it shared publicly. So maybe putting that in a virtual resource room would be helpful. In regards to the contracts as well, if you can't share the contract or put it in the resource room, and if you have an on-site evaluation, maybe just sharing it in the moment with the team when they're on site, and that's okay as well.
Yeah, I do want to emphasize that if a nursing program is using an online program manager or other third-party vendor to deliver support services, curriculum design development, advising students, enrolling students, this is required. You must provide these contracts and agreements. So it's not optional to provide them. How you provide them, we can be flexible, but it is not optional whether to provide them. And I think that one of the things that we would advise is that you do describe very clearly in your self-study or other reports to CCNE how the nursing unit, how the nursing programs are impacted and how they're relying on OPMs. We do need some specificity and understanding what is being outsourced, if you will, or contracted out, and that the program is assuring quality in those areas. So this is a new area of emphasis, certainly in Standard 2. Not just for CCNE, but we know that the institutional accreditors and other specialized accreditors are looking at this as well. Okay, I think we already emphasized number 4, how imperative it is for the program to provide details about the sufficiency and availability of clinical sites and the concerns that might arise if CCNE learns that students are not getting planned appropriate clinical, that if it delays students' progression in graduation because those clinical experiences were not provided, that's a concern. One of the questions that I saw in the chat was, what happens if the program provides a clinical opportunity for students and the students complained because they didn't want to travel that far? Do you want to comment, provide some insights there?
Yeah, sure. I'll comment. And the key here is the student was supported in finding a site. If the student declines the site, that's their personal preference and decision, but that's not the program's. The program can't force a student to accept the site, but as long as they have made that reasonable effort to make sure that the student has a site, that's what's important.
Yeah, I do want to emphasize, because there were also questions related to this, about a program's responsibility to clearly communicate what the expectations are for clinical and the requirements. And I think this goes back to
1F in Standard 1 that they
well, no, I'm thinking, I mean, there is discussion there under Standard 1, and I know we covered it in that webinar, but I'm looking specifically at key element 2C, where it states that the program provides students with information regarding the responsibilities of the program and, if any, the expectations of the student in identifying clinical sites. That needs to be clear. It needs to be in writing. And I would also say that students shouldn't be surprised.
Right. And that's why I took us back to 1F on that, Jen, because technical requirements was added to 1F when it talks about making sure that the academic policies are published and accessible. There shouldn't be any surprises, like you said.
Yeah. I think there was a question in the chat of whether this information needs to be communicated to students before they enroll. And I think, looking back at the language and the elaboration, the key element 1F is really good. And that the policies are written and communicated to relevant constituencies. It really gets back also to truth in advertising, which is actually key element 1H, which requires that references to the clinical requirements and placements are accurate. And so, that includes fees, if there are added costs for the students for any aspect of the program, including clinical, that needs to be clarified upfront. And the program needs to be transparent about that. In the event that the program might provide clinicals that are several-hour drives away or across the country, that also needs to be transparently communicated to the students so that they understand what the program's responsibilities are, what their own responsibilities are, and there aren't any surprises. Any other thoughts on that key element?
No, I just saw a
Yeah.
question pop up that's asked, what if they clearly and continually communicate to reduce surprises, but the students don't read it? They don't pay attention to the policies and to the information that's provided. And I think that kind of goes back to the same thing, you know, the goal here is that the information is made available to the constituents, prospective students, current students,
Yeah.
et cetera. Once again, we can't force them to read it, but that we provide it. That's what's important.
Right. Well, and I would say any program that sees a pattern of students being surprised and not completing the program on time, you know, should maybe also rethink how the information is being presented. You know, does the student have to click 10 links into a document to actually read the policy, or is it provided and discussed with all incoming students or prospective students? You know, do students need to sign an attestation or some form that they understand that they've read the information? Have they had an opportunity to ask questions? And so in the event that there are patterns and the program is seeing that a lot of their students seem surprised or are filing complaints about a particular matter, I would think that the program would study that further to try and make some improvements so that information is clear and provided to the students and acknowledged by the students so there aren't surprises later.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you for that, Jan.
Yeah, yeah. You know, there's another question. Well, I see that number 5 is probably one of the easiest things that could be provided, which is the CV for the chief nurse. But somebody asked the question about what are some examples of evidence programs could provide to demonstrate that the chief nurse administrator is an effective leader? Could you all comment on or make some observations about the types of things? And I invite our audience to type things into the chat. What evidence have you used, or what would you look to showcase the leadership of your chief nurse administrator? And I'll read those aloud if people want to type in their ideas. But first, let's see what our presenters have to say about that.
Yeah, I would say one of the most helpful pieces of supporting documentation, which you would probably not want to put in your resource room, is going to be an evaluation, a recent evaluation of the chief nurse administrator, because typically that's going to address their leadership abilities and their leadership qualities and how effective they are at leading their nursing unit. Other examples of data that you can collect are going to be, of course, your interviews, job description, just to make sure that everything is aligned, but interviews with the faculty, interviews with the university or college administrators, the community of interest. That's where you're going to get a lot of information about the chief nurse administrator's ability to effectively lead the nursing unit. But an evaluation might be a nice piece of supporting documentation that could be provided on site.
There's some others, and people have great ideas they've typed into the chat. You know, we're not requiring any particular one way that you would provide that evidence of the chief being an effective leader, but some people have typed that they have shared a 360 evaluation of administrators, recent changes made with improved outcomes backed by data. Another program asks a question about leadership effectiveness in the end of our program student evaluations. Another program uses the Best Christian Workplace survey that is sent out annually as one of our areas of evidence. Another program said that they present actual leadership achievements that have been done by the chief nurse administrators and evaluations by the faculty, grants, donations to the programs, responses to challenges and successes of the college or the programs, and improvement of the financial position of the college, faculty and student satisfaction surveys. So that's a lot of really great ideas that our program attendees have offered. So let's move to the next slide and look at the next several areas of supporting documentation that is required. Of course, number 6 relates to key element 2F. And we've talked a lot about 2F and the required information that needs to be presented there. If we look at the next slide, starting with supporting documentation number 9, again, here we see those 4 required bullets that only need to be addressed if there is any faculty member teaching clinical in a baccalaureate program who does not hold a graduate degree. Let's move on to the next set of supporting documentation, 10 through 13. We are going to want to see evidence that faculty overseeing an APRN track hold national certification and or advanced practice clinical experience in the same population focus area of practice as the track. Schedule of courses, faculty assignments, policies regarding faculty workload, the collective bargaining agreement, if it's appropriate, if there is a collective bargaining agreement. Any thoughts from our presenters about these areas of supporting documentation?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Let's go on and look at the last set. Here we go. This is an area where I think sometimes programs that omit things, and we put a greater emphasis on number 14 in the standards revision. It's really about the policies and or procedures regarding preceptor qualifications and evaluation. We want to know that the program has documented preceptor qualification and evaluation, and we want to see the materials that are used for preceptor orientation. I would say, based on my experience, sometimes programs forget to provide all of these, and that these aren't well documented. I think in many cases, the programs have not shown the evidence because they may not be documenting these things as well as they should be. Any thoughts from our presenters about number 14 and supporting documentation?
No, I would just agree with you, Dr. Butlin. This is an area that I have seen that sometimes programs don't provide all of the documentation, particularly, as I stated previously, about the ongoing evaluation of preceptors to ensure that they're continuing to do a quality job in precepting the students.
And also how it's managed or handled if there are issues or problems or challenges, and what's the next step and what that process looks like.
Great. And of course, supporting documentation number 14 relates to key element 2G, 2G like George. And so looking at the last two, we see a variety of policies and procedures from institutions regarding the support that is given for the professional development of faculty. Do our presenters have any comments or want to provide any examples?
Well, sometimes programs have workload policies where they talk about release time, what the typical workload looks like, or it may be in the university's handbook, what's required as far as teaching load, and those sorts of documents can help support number 15.
Somebody has asked the question, what are some ways that programs can evaluate preceptor performance? Dare I ask our audience to type in the chat? What are some ways that your program evaluates preceptor performance? I think your colleagues in the audience would love to see your answers to that. If people could type in the ways that their programs are evaluating preceptor performance. We have a lot of great ones coming in, mostly student evaluations of preceptors. There's also someone who has a 360-degree evaluation of preceptors. And of course, student evaluations of preceptors and the site. So some good ideas here. Any final thoughts on these areas of supporting documentation that CCNE requires related to Standard 2? Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot, and I know, Priya, you've covered a lot as you've been responding to questions in the chat. I think we've been able to respond to most of them. And if anybody has specific questions related to your program that you didn't want to type in the chat, you should feel free to contact the staff. Let's go to the last couple slides. I just have some closing announcements. I want to reiterate again that this is the second webinar in a 4-part series. And so we focused today on Standard 2. Last week, we had the webinar focusing on Standard 1. And I want to give you some dates for the next two webinars that we're delivering in the series. We have, we're going a little bit out of order based on when our presenters were available, but we've offered 1 and 2 now. And the webinar focusing on Standard 4 will be on December 4th. And the webinar focusing on Standard 3 will be on December 11th. So again, we're doing 4 on December 4th and Standard 3 on December 11th. That information on how to join can be found on the CCNE website. There's a call box if you scroll down on our website, so you can join those next webinars on Standards 4 and 3 in that order. And we welcome you to attend those sessions. I also want to remind you that this webinar today will be archived, and we will post both the PowerPoint presentation and the audio recording by the end of this week. So please encourage your colleagues to listen to today's webinar. You are also welcome to go back and listen to it again for reinforcement. And last week's webinar in Standard 4 also has already been posted along with the PowerPoints. So we hope you come back for the next 2 webinars addressing Standards 3 and 4. You'll find that information on our website, along with the Accreditation Connection Initiative and how to access those special sessions that are driven by particular topics. So with that said, I really want to thank Drs. Dunlap and Taylor for presenting, for volunteering for CCNE. We know that everyone appreciates all that you do to share your knowledge about accreditation and the expectations. I also want to thank our staff, Dr. Daniel Mikulski and Ms. Priya Lorenzen, for supporting our program constituents and our webinar series. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.